Hello, my name is Cluxton, and I'm a student at Hawaii Pacific University. My major is multimedia cinematic production, and oftentimes during my school projects or even through my professional work, I utilize these digital SLR cameras. Now today I have with me a Canon 5D Mark II full-frame DSLR. The settings on this camera are essentially the same across all digital SLR lines, even some that we see in our video production lab at school. Now the three basic settings I'm going to be talking about on this camera today is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And by balancing these three settings correctly, you're going to be able to obtain the perfect exposure. So the first setting, ISO, measures essentially how receptive your camera is to light or brightness. Low ISO settings, such as ISO 100 to 400, is often used for daylight or bright settings. On the other hand, high ISO settings, such as ISO 500 to 1600 and beyond, is used for more dim, dark, and low light settings. Now, the thing to remember is that high ISO creates more grain in your image, also known as noise. And noise can diminish the overall quality of your image. So you want to select an ISO that is not too high that it starts diminishing the other parts of your image. Now, ISO can be achieved and changed by clicking this button on the top of the camera and essentially just scrolling back and forth to select your high or low ISO settings. You can also achieve this by going into the menu bar, and you can see I have a chart similar to the one that I have on the screen of the PowerPoint, and again I can select from low to high ISO settings. The next basic setting I'm going to be talking about is aperture. Aperture is the adjustable opening and closing of the lens attached to your camera. This is measured by ratio to diameter, also known as f-stop. Smaller the f-stop number, such as 2.8, as you can see in this chart, is the more open the lens hole becomes, obviously letting in more light. A higher f-stop number, such as f22, yields a much smaller hole, letting in less light. Now, depth of field is the distance between the foreground and the background of your image in focus. A shallow depth of field is when your subject is in focus, while the rest of the background and foreground is oftentimes very blurry. This is achieved by using an aperture such as f2.8. On the other hand, a higher f-stop number will allow more of your image to be in focus, such as f22, which is known as having a greater depth of field. Now, just like ISO, you can change the aperture just by using the controls on the camera. You can use this back dial here that I'm spinning to select your low or high aperture. And just like ISO, if you really needed to go into the menu, you can also access this by this menu button. And you can see all my numbers here. And each lens is different. This lens is capable of going down to f4 and all the way up to f22. So remember, the smaller the number is, the more shallow depth of field you're going to have, and the higher the number is letting less light in and going to have a greater depth of field. Now the next setting I'm going to be talking about is shutter speed. Now shutter speed is the length of time your shutter is open to let in light. This setting is measured in fractions of a second. Therefore, a smaller fraction, such as 1/500th of a second, is a much faster shutter speed because the shutter is open and closed faster, which allows less light to enter the camera. On the other hand, a larger fraction, such as 1/80th of a second, means that the camera shutter is open for a longer time, therefore letting in more light. A high fraction, such as 1/60th or even less, is when your subject may be moving faster than your shutter speed, and this can create motion blur. On the other hand, when you have a very high shutter speed, this can create a very, very sharp image, if that's what you're trying to achieve. Now, your shutter speed can also be accessed by utilizing this dial on the top of the camera. And this is really helpful in settings where you're doing professional work and have to get the right shot or adjust the settings very quickly. But if you have the time, you can also go through the menu and quickly adjust your shutter speed on this digital screen, LCD screen. And you can adjust your shutter speed right there. And in conclusion, I have talked about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And all these settings work together to create a perfect exposure. And the thing to remember is that when any of these settings are changed, the others have to be changed as well to compensate for the light difference to create a new perfect exposure. Consider the fact that each of these have a secondary factor that will also affect your image. We talked about ISO, having noise at high ISO settings. Aperture, the smaller the number, is when you're going to create a shallow depth of field. And also shutter speed is the higher the number and the longer the shutter is, the more motion blur that you're going to have. Just to give you guys a perfect example, I am currently filming this video at an ISO of approximately 1600, an aperture of about 2.8, and a shutter speed of about 1/60th of a second to compensate for my 1080p 30 frame rate video. I hope you learned a lot by this presentation, and now you know the 3 basic settings of any digital SLR camera and how to easily change them to create your perfect exposure. Thank you.